No, ma'am.
It says the content of this meeting is being sent to a third party. Is that YouTube? Is that what's going on?
Yes, ma'am. Okay, so we are live now. So, good evening, everybody. Welcome to Karwan Distinguished Lecture on the topic Sheikh Abdullah, the Case Lion of Kashmir by Professor Chitraleka Zutshi. I am very excited to host Professor. So, Professor Chitraleka Zutshi is a distinguished historian specializing in modern South Asian and the Indian Ocean world with a particular focus on Islamic identities, political culture, nationalism, and historical thought. A leading scholar on the history and politics of Kashmir, she has extensively published and spoken on regions, contexts past, and its interactions with broader South Asian and global developments. Her research has appeared in renowned academic journals such as the Journal of South Asian Studies, Modern Asian Studies, and the Economic and Political Weekly, alongside contributions to platforms like Kashmir Connected. Professor Jutsi's latest book, Sheikh Abdullah, The Caste Lion of Kashmir, is a groundbreaking biography of the influential and controversial Kashmiri leader, Sheikh Abdullah. Lauded for its depth and insights, this book has been shortlisted for the prestigious including the Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay Book Award and the Author Award for Best Non-Fiction by an Indian women author. Her previous works include Kashmir's Contested Past, which received an honorable mention for the Ananda Kanist Kumaraswamy Book Prize, and The Languages of Belonging, a seminal study on Kashmir's regional and religious identities. A PhD graduate from Tufts University, Professor Jutsi has received numerous fellowships, including those from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the Library of Congress. She teaches at Williams and Mary, where she offers courses on South Asian history, colonialism, nationalism, and the Indian Ocean world. An award-winning educator, she has directed study abroad programs in India and served in leadership roles within the university's Asian and Middle Eastern Studies program. Throughout her scholarship and teaching, professors continues to shape the discourse on South Asian history, offering perspective on the region's political and cultural landscape. So, on behalf of Teen Carbon, I welcome you, ma'am. And without any further ado, over to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Srishti, for that very long and very laudatory introduction. I'm very happy to be back on Caravan. This is the second time I'm joining the series, and I'm pleased to be talking to you about my latest book, Sheikh Abdullah, The Caged Lion of Kashmir. Just a quick note about the book itself. It was published in the Indian Live series with HarperCollins Publishers. The series editor of this series is Ramchandra Guha. And 3 of the books have been published in this series so far: Ashoka, Sheikh Abdullah, and then Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay. Now, my book is also published here in the US by Yale University Press. So you might see 2 different covers floating around on the internet. One is, of the 2 editions, but they're exactly the same. They're the same book. Now, what I'm going to do today is talk to you about the process of kind of writing the book, how I came to do it, and what it took to actually write this book. And then the other thing that I'll do is talk about a little bit about the book itself and what my conclusion was about Sheikh Abdullah. Obviously, I'm sure you're interested in that since it's a biography. And I hope to kind of pique your interest enough so that you borrow or buy the book and read it. It's not an extremely lengthy book, and it's written in a way that is, I hope, or have been told, accessible to readers across the board. So now, the question that emerges, of course, is that, why biography and why a biography of Sheikh Abdullah, right? So I'm a historian. And I wasn't trained to be a biographer. I wasn't trained to think about the world through the prism of one individual. So this was a very difficult task for me. But I realized that focusing on an individual actually allows you to see sort of broader developments in ways that, again, as I said, can be accessible to readers across the board, not just to other historians. So I, as Shrishti pointed out, I already had a background in the history of Kashmir. I'd written several books. But so now it was just a matter of kind of, you know, looking at those developments, but also looking at developments as a whole in the subcontinent, through the eyes of Sheikh Abdullah, and really looking at what that teaches us about what happened in this 20th century, right? So he lived from 1905 to 1980, 1982. So this, long period of time, which, the 20th century is a very, very significant time in the history of the world, but also the history of the subcontinent. So all of the changes that happened, Sheikh Abdullah and Kashmir played a very important role in them, right? So I wanted to look at that through his eyes, but it was very difficult, I have to admit, I had to constantly remind myself when I was writing that this was, a biography, that it had to be about this man's life and not just about these broader socio-cultural, political developments. Now, why a biography of Sheikh Abdullah? In some ways, I have been writing this in my head for 25 years. When I first started research on Kashmir, um, and I went there to sort of, make a foray in 1995, 96, to make a foray into, trying to figure out what sources were available for my dissertation, which became my first book, Languages of Belonging. I was told by everyone, I used to sit down in a library or an archive, and I used to talk to the archivist or the librarian, and they would say, Madam, अगर आपको कश्मीर की तारीख पे लिखना है तो आपको 3 किताबें पढ़ने की जरूरत है, राइट? सो इफ यू वांट टू राइट अबाउट द हिस्ट्री ऑफ कश्मीर, यू नीड टू रीड 3 बुक्स. तो एक है कल्हन की राज तरंगिनी, राइट? कल्हना's राज तरंगिनी, which is 12th century, mid 12th century history of Kashmir. The second, and it jumps several centuries, is Walter Lawrence's Valley of Kashmir, which was in the late 19th century, written by a colonial official who was the revenue or settlement commissioner of Jammu and Kashmir. And the third is Sheikh Abdullah's Aatesh-e-Chinar, Ek Aap Biti, which is his autobiography. So what they said is that, if you read these 3 books, and if you're really working on the modern history of Kashmir, all you really need to read is Sheikh Abdullah's book, because, in their minds, the modern history of Kashmir is synonymous with Sheikh Abdullah and Sheikh Abdullah's life, right? His autobiography is basically a story of his life. So they said, if you read these 3 books, you'll be done. Alas, it was not so easy. That's not how you write anything, right? You can't just read 3 books and write. So I didn't take their advice, and I read a whole bunch and collected all sorts of sources. But Sheikh Abdullah figured in my first book, right? Because he's a very important political leader, and that book is about regional national identities in Kashmir from the sorry, late 18th to the mid 20th centuries. So, um, I wrote about him in my first book, but it was really done not through, his life, but rather through these larger political developments. Now, when I started writing my second book, which is Kashmir's Contested Past, which is a history of the way that Kashmiris think about their history, that's when I really realized how important Sheikh Abdullah is to the way that Kashmiris conceptualize themselves. Right? And that's when it started dawning on me that I had to write a biography of this figure. Now, it took me much longer after that, right? So I wrote that second book, and then it was published in 2014. And that's when I really, in earnest, began to research Sheikh Abdullah's life. Now, that's again easier said than done, because Sheikh Abdullah hasn't really left behind a very large corpus of writing, right? So most biographers run into this issue when they are doing a biography. There's too much writing by the figure they're writing about. So what they end up doing is writing a biography from that person's perspective alone, because they're so inundated with their ideas and their thoughts. In my case, it was the opposite problem, which is that I had very little written by Sheikh Abdullah other than this autobiography. And scattered things here and there that he had written. So what I had to do is really rely on writing a biography of not just Abdullah, but a generation, right? The people around him. um, who made it possible for him to emerge as a leader and then sustained his leadership through the years, right? So people like Muhammad Afzal Beg or Premnath Bazaz, um, even Jawaharlal Nehru, right? Sardar Patel, Jayaprakash Narayan, all of these very important figures in the history of the subcontinent actually had a very important role to play in kind of formulating the way that Sheikh Abdullah thought about his politics, the way that he acted as a politician, his ideologies, his ideas, and so on. So, this biography is a biography of one figure, but it's really about all of these associates and people around him. Yeah. So, in some ways, the fact that he had not written a lot helped me to, have a broader perspective um, on this figure. So, what I did was, of course, I did the usual archival research and published materials and so on. I already had a corpus of stuff that I'd collected, so that came in handy. But then I went around carrying out sort of oral history interviews from people who had either known Sheikh Abdullah or worked with him. So I was able to, for instance, find, and I did this from not just his kind of, close associates and people at the same level as him, but even middle level workers or his security detail or security guard, for instance. He was a very elderly gentleman that one of my contacts put me in touch with, and I went to visit him in this village in the Kashmir Valley, and he told me, gave me a very personal look at the way that Sheikh Abdullah kind of functioned on a day-to-day level, because he was always with him. He was his body man, right? I mean, he was the security um, detail. So so I collected oral histories from all of these, all of these people, and that across, they were in Kashmir, they were in Jammu, some were in Bombay, and Delhi, Jaipur, all over the place. And the the other place that I went to do research, I have the privilege of living and working in America. And so I was able to access the National Archives here. And the National Archives in America that has State Department records from the 1940s and 50s. And it's very interesting how the Americans are looking at Kashmir and at Sheikh Abdullah as well, right? So these are, I put together all of these sources, and I was able to uh, you know, c- basically stitch together this narrative of this one person's life, surrounded by all of these people. So now, if you think about, um, you think about how I have, what are some of the themes that run through the book, right? Other than the fact that it's about Sheikh Abdullah's life. There are two very important themes that in some ways defined him as an individual, right? So the first of these themes is prison, right? So Sheikh Abdullah was in prison for 16 years, 6 months, and 22 days. Not at one go, of course, but in and out, either in prison or in exile or in house arrest, under house arrest, either by the Dogra government, since he led a movement against the Dogra state, or as a prisoner of the post-colonial Jammu and Kashmir government, right? So prison was really something that marked him and defined him. Prison allowed him to become, to rise up as a leader, to emerge as a leader, because people, Kashmiris really felt that, he was willing to give up his own freedom for their freedom, right? So prison is a really important theme that runs through his life. Um, so literally prison is, so he was put away and so on, so that allowed him to rise as a leader. And then metaphorically speaking, prison is something as well that defines his life, because he was imprisoned in some ways by the Kashmir Valley, right? So he always felt as a leader that he drew his legitimacy from the Kashmir Valley. When he envisioned a nation or nationalism in Kashmir, he thought of the Kashmir Valley. He had the opportunity later on in his life to be the leader of sort of Indian Muslims, but he did not take that opportunity because he felt that his work was in Kashmir. So the Kashmir Valley really kept him, surrounded him and defined him, right? So he saw himself as a Kashmiri Muslim first, last, and always, I mean, that was his identity. And he wanted to be the only leader of Kashmiri Muslims. He wanted to be the sole representative, if you will, right? So, so that's one theme that runs through the book. The other theme is of sacred spaces, so by sacred spaces, I mean, Kashmir's mosque, shrines, and so on. Now, Sheikh Abdullah was able to um, assert his authority, right, by gaining control of these sacred spaces. So, sacred spaces in Kashmir have always been important in the political arena, right? They have provided all sorts of leaders with control over the narrative, right? Because say, the shrines and mosques, are where people go to for spiritual sustenance, but also, to connect with a leadership, right? And so what Sheikh Abdullah did in the 1930s is he sidelined the traditional sort of mirwais or head preacher leadership in the valley, and took control of most of the sacred spaces, right? And then when he later on asserted the sovereignty of Kashmir as sort of autonomous and independent, he also did it through these sacred spaces. So, um, so for instance, in the 1970s, when his popularity was at a low ebb, he decided he decided to rebuild the Hazrat Bal shrine, which some of you might have, heard of or seen pictures of, which used to be this wooden structure that he, rebuilt into a marble structure, resembling the Prophet's mosque in Medina. And this is how he kind of tried to reconnect with the people of Kashmir by saying that, this is where, our sovereignty is tied to these sacred spaces. So sacred spaces are really important theme that also runs through this book. The other thing that, Sheikh Abdullah's life makes us really rethink, right? Are these kind of monolithic, unitary territorial sovereignties of India and Pakistan, right? Because both India and Pakistan laid claim to the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir. And if you look at it through Sheikh Abdullah's life, however, you realize that he asserted this independent sovereignty for Kashmir, as I was talking about through the sacred spaces and else in other ways. He asserted an independent sovereignty for Kashmir. He came up with the idea. He was really the votary of Kashmiri nationalism, right? He came from a very modest background, right? His father had died before he was born. His mother raised him in very economically straitened circumstances. And yet he was able to rise up, and that's one of the reasons I think that he rose up, um, rise up to be the leader of Kashmiri Muslims. And he felt always that he had a responsibility, right, to these people whom he had seen being, poor and downtrodden and impoverished and um, ill-treated by the state, to stand up for their rights and their freedoms. And eventually, what this did was he came up, or was one of the main sort of votaries of the idea of the Kashmiri nation, right? So he said, the Kashmiris are a nation. And in 1946, he sent a letter to the cabinet mission saying that, Kashmiris are a nation like all of these other, whether it's India or Pakistan or whoever is talking about, nationality, and we deserve freedom. We deserve freedom from Dogra rule. We deserve freedom to live our own lives, chart our own course. And he, and in some ways, that is the most enduring legacy of Sheikh Abdullah's life, right? This idea of the Kashmiri nation that he gave birth to, which then after fighting for the rights of Kashmiris for decades, he sort of seemed to give up on in 1975 when he came, when he made an accord with Indira Gandhi that basically made him chief minister of Jammu and Kashmir in exchange for basically giving up on the idea of Kashmiri self-determination and Kashmiri freedom and so on. And again, that was a taint on his legacy, right? Because his legacy was to champion the rights of Kashmiris until that point, for which he went to prison for decades, right? Um, but then in 1975, he appeared to give it up all. He did a volte-face, he gave it all up very quickly. And so a younger generation of Kashmiris kind of, turned against him for that. This is one of the other reasons that I was so intrigued by Sheikh Abdullah's life, because you find such a huge shift in the way that people perceive him, right? So for our older generation, right, and that would be your grandparents, my parents' generation, um, Sheikh Abdullah was the embodiment of freedom for Kashmiris. He single-handedly lifted them up from their downtrodden situation and gave them respect and gave them a reason to be call themselves Kashmiri and be proud of it, right? And then uh, the people who are middle-aged in the 40s and 50s now have this real deep sense of betrayal, right? Because they feel that he gave up on that idea. At first, he created it, he built it up, and then he gave up on it in 1975 when he came to an accord. Um, and then the younger generation, your generation, Kashmiris, feels that, why do we talk about Sheikh Abdullah at all anymore? Because he's not, he did some interesting things back then, but we are not, we are living in this reality and we don't need to, learn that much about him. So there was a very wide range of kind of ideas about him when I talked to people about his life and his legacy and so on. But this is, as I was saying, the Accord in 1975 is really also part of his legacy. And when he became chief minister in 1975 as a result of this Accord, that's when he started to write his autobiography, right? Atishe Chinar, which I started this talk with, and something that I was encouraged to read to learn about the modern history of Kashmir. And the reason that he wrote this is to kind of resurrect or rehabilitate his legacy, right? Which was now under assault because people thought that he had betrayed the cause of Kashmiris. And so the autobiography reads like an apologia for his actions, right? So and also kind of builds him up as being, basically single-handedly giving birth to a movement and then and then leading it on and so on. So that's where you find sort of Sheikh Abdullah really, uh, you know, he at the end of his life he was disappointed, right? Because he had fought so long and hard since he was a young man for this freedom, which the Kashmiris didn't achieve, and he played a role in basically foreclosing the possibility of that ever happening. And he was very, very sad. He was, he was sad about the past. He was sad about, the present. He was sad about the future because he wasn't sure that the National Conference, the political party that he had given birth to, would survive, right? And what shape it would take. So that's that was the sort of end of his life. But let me also say one more thing. So I was talking about the importance that other people around him played. So let me talk about a few people. Jawaharlal Nehru, of course, everyone knows, and so I'll talk about Jawaharlal Nehru had um, uh, Sheikh Abdullah met Nehru in 1937, and they were so impressed with each other. Sheikh Abdullah was particularly impressed with Nehru, um, that he decided, Sheikh Abdullah did, that he was going to align the movement in Kashmir, which had begun in 1931, right? So this is 1937, 6 years later, that the Jammu and Kashmir Muslim Conference that he had founded would be transformed into the Jammu and Kashmir National Conference, because he wanted to align more closely with the objectives of the Congress party, right? which was talking about sort of this composite nationalism. But Sheikh Abdullah fervently believed, right, in the possibility of the Kashmiri nation existing within the Indian nation, right? I mean, this was, he had this idea of a very federated system of government if India was to become independent, right? But he always felt that India was the place where Kashmiris could achieve their political and economic objectives, right? And Nehru had a very important role to play in this because Abdullah truly believed in the promise of India as articulated by leaders such as Nehru. Um, Now, all this kind of broke down when India was partitioned, right? And you had two countries that came into existence, India and Pakistan, that were at loggerheads with each other. And this dream that Abdullah had of Kashmir having a place in a united India fell apart with it. But he kept trying that, right? So Kashmir itself, of course, was partitioned by 1949, not partition as in with the partition in 1947, but because India and Pakistan fought over it. And then eventually there was a ceasefire line that was drawn. So part of Kashmir went to Pakistan, part in India, which is the situation today as well. Um, and this made it impossible because there was no united Kashmir anymore, right? The Kashmir Valley was in India, and then India and Pakistan were at war with each other over it, whether it was a hot war or a cold war. And so, Sheikh Abdullah, even in 1947, threw his lot in with India and said, this is the place that we, should be a part of, and so on. And then, um, began to really repress his own people's rights, right? So the people became unhappy with him, so he began repression, um, and eventually, by 1953, that he had changed. He changed again, and he started speaking out against India and for autonomy in these kind of international fora. And by 1953, he had been deposed in an internal sort of National Conference Party coup, right? And his relationship with Nehru grew, obviously, I mean, and Nehru had given his approval for this removal, right? So the relationship kind of um, became, broke down, right? Abdullah always felt that Nehru would protect him from anything that was going to happen. But Nehru himself, right, he's a prime minister. He's not just Abdullah's friend. And he was the head of a very large bureaucracy in a country and so on. So he couldn't just be, so Abdullah kind of misjudged all that. In any case, that was a friendship that was important. The other thing that you have to remember, sort of recognize about Abdullah is that he was surrounded by communists and socialists in the formative parts of his political life. So in the late 1930s, early 1940s, throughout the 40s, and so his vision for Kashmir, when you think about sort of what kind of a state Kashmir would be, was driven by these concerns of equality, right? Equality for everyone, equality for the lower classes, equality for women. And his signature um, uh, policy during his time as Prime Minister of Kashmir from 1948 to 1953 was passing land reforms, right? And in the land reforms, he returned land to the peasants and took land away from large landlords without compensation. So that is something he's still remembered for in Kashmir, right? In a positive way, in other words. But again, that also caused a whole bunch of embitterment and led to his removal ultimately. So, there were many um, global, domestic, regional, local ideas that really drove him and made him the leader that he was. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to end with just reading from the book a little bit, right? Probably 5 minutes, not that much. So that you get a sense of this is towards the end, right? So Sheikh Abdullah's was a fundamentally 20th century life, shaped by the global and regional forces of that turbulent century. He was born and raised at the peripheries of the British Empire in India, his political personality forged in the inequities of the princely state system and burnished in the flames of early 20th century anti-colonial nationalism. Like many Muslims around the colonial world at this time, his political worldview was shaped by Islamic universalism alongside a fervent attachment to a regional identity that produced what can be termed a vernacular, particularistic nationalism with a dash of socialist ideals thrown in. He saw a kindred spirit in Jawaharlal Nehru and his organization, the Indian National Congress, which espoused a pluralism and socialism that he found absent from Muhammad Ali Jinnah's two nation theory that seemed comfortably feudal even as it pitted Hindus and Muslims against each other. But it was more than that. He did not want Kashmir's identity and autonomy, and by extension his own leadership, to be subsumed in the entity that succeeded the British in the subcontinent. And a federal India made up of semi autonomous units rather than Pakistan offered the best possibility of realizing his aspirations for Kashmir and for himself. Decolonization, accompanied by the partition of British India into India and Pakistan, put paid to these dreams. Deeply disappointed and fearful of what the years ahead held for Kashmir, he weighed the pros and cons of joining both states. But as its future hung in the balance, he was left with no choice than to accept the state's accession to India. This turned out to be a Faustian deal that would haunt him for the rest of his political career. From 1947 onwards, Abdullah became a participant in, as well as a victim of, the post colonial state's agenda of integrating and centralizing its diverse territories. Post colonial India's anxieties about nation, territory, and sovereignty expressed themselves most acutely at its frontiers. In this particular case, in Jammu and Kashmir, a Muslim majority state integral to its secular identity and security, and also claimed by Pakistan, where the fiction of the center's exercise of unitary sovereignty under a composite Indian nationalism was most apparent. Abdullah, as votary of a fierce regional nationalism, became both the face of these anxieties as well as the sole means of their alleviation. This dual role captures the fraught nature of center-state relations as well as the complexities of state politics in post-colonial India. In particular, it illustrates the Indian center's troubled relationship with and response to identitarian and other demands from its restive peripheries, which it has sought to control through a mixture of personalities, governance strategies, and economic incentives designed to mollify their populations. This has had the effect not only of creating insurgent subjects, but also of recreating the center region relationship within the states themselves, with a dominant regional center imposing its will on its sub regions. Two related priorities drove Abdullah at all times: to maintain the position of his party, the National Conference, to ensure his own position as leader of the party and sole representative of Kashmiri Muslims in the Kashmir Valley. He was willing to quote extremes in service of these goals, and he often did. So his colleagues and his supporters overlooked some of these, quoting of extremes. But when it became clear that he was losing popularity and so on, they kind of, ditched him. So when he died, Sheikh Abdullah, it's interesting. All of the people, these people that I said, his associates, this entire generation that had stood by him, that had shaped his political career, that had shaped his ideas, none of them were there. He died a lonely man. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. And on behalf of Team Karwan, I would really express my gratitude to Professor for such an enlightenment lecture, and you have guided us through a way. So thank you so much. And I'm checking a checkbox if we have any
Yeah,
question.
of course.
Yes, we have a question. So I'm just reading a question. Could it also be that Sheikh accepted the seat in exchange of not being jailed, just like the opposition during the emergency, perhaps rendered helpless by indefinite jail, even if he wanted to protest?
Yeah, of course, it's probably likely, right? But he had been in political wilderness for so long. One of the things that happened when Sheikh Abdullah was kind of taken out of Kashmir, and he was under house arrest in Kodaikanal, right? So he's all the way in the south, that he lost touch with the people in Kashmir, right? I mean, if you're not there, your face is not showing, I mean, and you're not actually, on the ground, then you have no idea what people are thinking, right? So he was deeply afraid that people in Kashmir would forget him, right? I mean, that if he wasn't able to rejoin politics in an active way, that he would become obsolete, right? Um, Now, a whole new generation of leaders had emerged in Kashmir, right, which he knew, right? And so he was afraid that these people didn't have, Sheikh Abdullah was a very powerful symbol, even if he wasn't there, right? His memory was kept alive. Um, and he was constantly sort of, engaging with politics there. So this younger generation of leaders who had emerged, who were much more sort of, separatist, if you will, they didn't have the kind of um, stature that Sheikh Abdullah did. But that didn't stop Sheikh Abdullah from feeling like he was being kind of left out of politics and left behind and so on. So I think that was one of the big reasons why he finally decided that perhaps from within the system itself, right, that he would be able to work out something. The other reason, of course, is that he was an aging man, right? I mean, he was much older. He was not doing particularly well health-wise. Um, his family had been separated and divided and lived in sort of, straitened circumstances because he was, always in prison, in and out, and so on. So his family also wanted him to come to some sort of a compromise so this they could put this behind them, right? But as I said, I mean, the way that it was done, it was basically done behind closed doors. It didn't include most Kashmiri political leaders. It was basically Sheikh Abdullah and Mirza Afzal Beg that did this. And so people felt that, where did this come from? I mean, yesterday you're talking about Kashmiri nationalism, never compromising, and today suddenly you made this deal, right? So that, I think that is what, um, so yeah, the reasons why he did it were of course complicated, right? One of the other big reasons he did this deal in when he did was that after the Bangladesh war, Pakistan had been had lost a part, like East Pakistan had become Bangladesh, and Pakistan was in a much more attenuated state. So, it was no longer sort of a bargaining chip for him, right? Because one of the things he kept telling India is that if you don't do right by Kashmiris, they'll go to Pakistan, right?
Hmm.
So now, if Pakistan itself has become so weak, then how can he use that as a bargaining chip, right? So that was another reason why he felt that, it's better to just, make some sort of deal with India. But he instantly regretted it. As soon as he did it and he went out there, he started talking to people or, giving speeches and so on, and the reaction, he realized that this was not a good, he hadn't made the right choice, but it was too late by then. So he tried to come back from it several times. So his entire career from 1975 to his death in 1982 was basically trying to fight back against India again, but from inside, as the chief minister. So
Thank you so much, ma'am, for the answer. And I guess we don't have any question anymore. So thank you so much, ma'am, joining in. And thank you so much, everybody who have joined us for this live. Thank you so much.
okay.